Yeah, I can. Well, I'm transitioning into the slides.
Keith, he said thinks he's ready. I think I'm ready.
Well, he's not on here, so
You call in.
he's going to take it from the comfort of his own home by himself.
That's good.
Whose dog is that? That is mine that I'm getting ready to go get real quickly. Brian, that's a sore topic in this house.
All right, so we are live right now, but I'm not hearing back from Keith.
Okay. Well, good evening, Brentwood. This is Brian Lane, Superintendent of the Brentwood School District, and I am joined tonight by Lindsay Spencer, Board of Education President, Jamie Allen, Board of Education Vice President, and shortly I believe we're also going to be joined by Keith Ravenberg, one of our Board of Education Directors. So we're excited this evening to talk to you about Proposition E. So I'd like to start this off by talking a little bit about the overall proposition and the timeline and how we got to where we're at today. And then we are going to answer some questions that have already been submitted. And then we're also taking live questions throughout the evening that we'd like to have the opportunity to address. So at this point, let me go ahead and I will share my screen with you all. Right. So as I said, we are taking live questions throughout the evening. So that is actually, there's a link to the Google form in your video description as you watch YouTube. And you can also see here is a bit.ly address that you can go directly to. And once we finish our answering the questions that have already been turned in, we are going to do our best to get through and answer all the live questions. So I'd like to take an opportunity here to just talk to you a little bit about the timeline, because this has been a extensive and detailed process for the Brentwood School District. And it goes back to 2013 when it became very apparent to the district that they did have extensive facility needs. They started to explore this with the district's current architectural firm and began doing some extensive studies. But unfortunately, at that time, they did realize that they had some needs in the operating expenses. And so they refocused and luckily were able to pass a proposition and basically correct things in that realm. So then that allowed them in 2015 to go back to the task at hand and to look at the district facilities committee was first established. So this was a large group of community stakeholders. And then ultimately that group, through an extensive process, identified that there were considerable needs at all the sites. And ultimately, it was found that those needs were higher than the bonding capacity for the district. So the decision was made at that time that we would do a two-phased approach to fixing the facilities in the Brentwood School District. So phase one, as we know, was a no tax increase bond issue that resulted in $16 million to spend at the middle school, high school. The district supplemented that with an additional $2 million from our capital projects reserves for the district. And that project is continuing now. It's going very, very well. And we anticipate that project being complete in August, and excited by then that we'll be able to bring the community in and see the wonderful things that that has done for the district. And then in 2018, we put a separate committee together to study the issue of how to best address our elementary school needs. They did a long-term study, also involved a survey of the community, and it ultimately led to a lot of great discourse with our stakeholders and with our overall community. It did become quite clear through this process that our key stakeholders very much wanted the district to offer 2 K through 5 neighborhood schools. There was a lot of support for that, and the Board of Education and myself listened to those key stakeholders, and that ultimately led to the decision to place Proposition E on the April 7th, 2020 ballot. And at that point, as we all well know, COVID-19 hit our community along with the rest of the world. And so at that point, one of the first things that happened is they moved the election date back to June 2nd. So, you know, in many conversations, both with the community, getting their feedback, and in particular with the Board of Education, was the belief that to do our due diligence as a school district and as a Board of Education, we needed to look at this particular issue and adjust plans accordingly. So after much conversations about that, ultimately, the board passed a resolution that, to address the potential long-term financial impacts of a global pandemic, that we pledged that within the same amount of money that we would incorporate the Brentwood Early Childhood Center into one of the elementary schools. And a little later on, as part of our questions, we'll go into some more details about why that's a good idea and why that is feasible. So ultimately, this resolution was passed that within the $29 million, we would still have two K-5 buildings. It's still going to be a new McGrath. It's still going to be an extensively renovated Mark Twain Elementary, with the only change being that we would ultimately be able to take the district's footprint from 4 sites down to 3, reducing long-term operational expenses for the district. As a district, we always like to take our decisions back to our mission, vision, and values that were established both by our Board of Education and by our staff. I think as you look at these, you can see where our current plan to have 2 neighborhood schools, to maintain our current class sizes, to have an early childhood center that is in a neighborhood and that is directly connected to our elementaries, certainly supports and directly ties into our mission, vision, and values here in the Brentwood School District. So our needs remain as they have, and the key ones being accessibility. Both of our elementary schools are mainly not accessible to our parents and our students with disabilities. We have needs in terms of secure and, may I say, healthy entrances now will also be a focus, and we'll talk a little bit later in terms of COVID-19 and potential future pandemics and what that could look like in terms of designing a building. We have the need for flexible learning spaces and modern classrooms that meet the way that we know how to teach children in the Brentwood School District, that would support project-based learning, that would allow us those STEM and maker spaces that we can utilize with our students. It would also lead to energy efficiency. We have significant infrastructure needs at both buildings, plumbing, electrical, roofing, all of those things that are currently causing higher operational cost, and that's going to be significantly reduced. And it will also include updated flooring, lighting, bathrooms, and exteriors. So this is just a reminder that our buildings are an average age of 73 years old. And even though we work very hard to always try to maintain those buildings, it becomes an issue of not inefficiency, I suppose you would say, when you have, old copper pipes, ancient, HVAC systems, and those types of things. So we are continuing to keep those up as best we can, but it is an increasingly high cost every year. Here is just a frequently asked questions. So this is a 47-cent increase for the bond issue. And a reminder that yes, we will be able to, with this money, we pledge that we're going to be able to completely rebuild McGrath, a significant renovation of all of Mark Twain Elementary, and it will also allow us to incorporate the Early Childhood Center. Just a reminder that Election Day is coming up here in a couple of weeks, so we're hoping that everyone comes out to vote on June 2nd. Now, at this point, I would like us to go back into our questions and start with those. So, first one is for me, I believe. I'll take this one. And the question is, great question. If Prop E passes, what would be the timeline? So if it passes on June 2nd, then we would be looking at roughly a year or a little bit over a year of a comprehensive design process. So that is going to be a process that would involve community stakeholders, the Board of Education, district administrators, teachers, and staff, as we would go through multiple iterations of the plan to get the best possible use of those district funds to accomplish this mission. Ultimately, the complete construction process would be done by the fall of 2022. So that would be exciting. Next, if we could, we have a question that was submitted. Someone asked, what would be the ramifications if Prop E does not pass? Let's see, Mr. Allen, would you start that one off for us?
Sure, I'll give it a go. So a couple things. I mean, one, if it does not pass, are the schools falling down and we're not going to be able to deliver to our students in the ensuing years? The short answer is no. I mean, we are going to be able to do that, and we're going to continue to work hard to do that. The longer answer is we're going to put the burden on our facilities team and our board, our future board and administration, to figure out how best to spend the monies that we have to keep these facilities running. I mean, a couple key things right now that we know have been in front and center in the elementary schools, particularly on the McGrath side, are accessibility. So in the absence of this, one of the things we're really going to have to figure out how to fund and do is making sure that that building becomes more accessible, right? And that's not cheap. So now what happens is, if you think back to the timeline Dr. Lane went through, in 2013 with Prop K, we went to the taxpayers and all of us said, yes, we want to put money into operations, which was phenomenal. As part of that, we've had the economy has turned around and the board has actively been putting money into what we've all heard, this capital fund. And part of that, well, not part of that, all the monies within that are restricted to only be used for capital related projects, things more than $1,000 on your facilities. Why I bring this up is accessibility. You know, if we think about security, that's a big deal, right? Right now, we know we have issues with that. All of those things would require capital dollars, which would require us to spend against that capital fund, which is fine. The problem we run into is without this, we now are forced to decide with that fixed set of dollars or revenue coming in from us, where and what do we start giving in on in terms of dollars. So one of the things that future boards or future boards may decide is that we need to start putting more money away to capital, right? Which comes out of the operating side. And here's the challenge now. When we're trying to get creative with programming, when we're trying to reward our teachers and staff and administration, right, for delivering high quality education, we're now making tough decisions. So I think the takeaway of this is if it doesn't pass, we're going to be, our current board, future board, they're going to be forced to make some pretty tough decisions. It's a big ask, but I do think that the big thing for us to think through is really, above anything else, accessibility and security are really, really important pieces that we know both facilities could use. And so front and center is going to be how do we go fund that? And part of this is going to be taking a long, hard look at our budget and how we make dollars go as far as possible.
Yeah, and I would just add into that if this doesn't pass, I mean, we're paying a lot of money to maintain these two elementary schools right now, and that cost is only going to increase as they age and we are not able to update them. So there will be an increased cost for our maintenance, like Jamie is saying, which eventually will come out of our operating costs. And unfortunately, at some point, we would have to come back to the voters again to help pay for that. It'd be great to finish this with a facilities bond right now.
Yeah, I think one other thing is this could take a lot of different forms, right? It could take, hey, we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out a different proposition, right? A different configuration in terms of an ask. So that's an option. The other thing to consider, you know, that if it doesn't pass, right now, debt is relatively cheap, right? It's our ability to go do things. We are, one of the good things about us where we are fiscally right now, we have excellent credit. We have very good bonding capacity. And on top of that, debt, as we all know in this crazy world we're in, is relatively cheap. That allows us to do more things within the scope of that dollar range. If it doesn't pass and we're able to go back to with a different, smaller scale, the cost of debt may be different, right? And so our ability to go do as much may change. And so one of the things that may happen is we come back with a different idea and we are only able to really focus on some really key things. So, you know, look, the schools aren't going to shut down next year if we don't pass this. We've got a phenomenal facilities team that's there, that's working with us. The board is actively committed to doing work around facilities planning. So from that perspective, I think, you know, look, we're not at risk of having to close down programming in the short term. Where we do run into some challenges is we're going to have to make some really tough choices in terms of how we take the dollars we have and what we spend them on.
Those are excellent points from both of you. And you know, there are examples of things that even if we're willing to put money towards cannot be fixed. An example, to go back to Jamie's point about accessibility, I can give you an example at McGrath Elementary where we have some of our students with disabilities that are not able to access the cafeteria. And we have brought in consultants, and it was not an issue of cost. It's just an issue of there was not a solution in that building that could be put into place. So that cannot be fixed. And then you also have, to Lindsay's point, expenses that are much more exorbitant than they would be in a newer and updated building. I could give you many examples, but you know, example of one at McGrath before we had to go out and have the students out was we had a faucet, hot water faucet that went out in one of the bathrooms that we needed to have fixed. What would normally be a very minimal cost ended up being thousands of dollars due to ancient pipes that had to be rerouted. There had to be some asbestos removed. I could give you weekly examples of this from our maintenance department of costs that are much more than they would be or frankly should be. So if we could, we have another question that I would ask Lindsay to take the lead on, which is, what are the advantages or disadvantages of incorporating the early childhood into one of the elementary schools?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So the Early Childhood Center, I mean, our school board and our district, and I think I can speak for most of the families that have utilized the Early Childhood Center, we're very proud of that program, and it's grown over the years. And so our goal is always to support the Early Childhood Center, and with this incorporating it into the elementary schools, we would want to continue to support and enhance that program. Some of the benefits, I think, of bringing the Early Childhood Center into an elementary setting would be the increased green space that would be available to our students. Right now in the Hanley Industrial Court, they've done, I think they've done a phenomenal job to make use of every square inch of the outside space that they have for gardens and such, but I do think having more green space for our Early Childhood Center kids would be great. I think there's an opportunity to utilize some of the specials teachers that are already at our elementary schools. That would include the counselor. We've got great art teachers, music teachers, PE teachers that could be utilized by our Early Childhood Center staff and students. And the one goal that we've been talking about a lot with finances is if we are able to pull the Early Childhood Center into one of our neighborhood schools, we can reduce our facilities footprint from 4 to 3, which is a great financial decision in the long term for our district when we can save some money down the road with maintenance and facilities. The disadvantage that I think is it's change, and there are some unknowns, which would be kind of fleshed out during the design process of this new facility or the remodel with Mark Twain. I would say those are the biggest disadvantages, just unknowns, and it is a change from what we have right now.
I think, Lindsay, I'd add, so I think the biggest disadvantage is that, right, there's change, there's unknown, the scope of kind of the original conversations around the elementary school is different. And we know that means there's give and take. So that's probably the biggest thing. But as Brian said, putting a team together to figure this out, I think, where we are, it makes a lot of sense. The other advantage is, we just are able to leverage a unique opportunity and create some financial flexibility. And so, do we know exactly what we would do with that building right now? No. And we should own up to that. However, it does allow for us to have flexibility and to take advantage of some potentially unique opportunities. Whether, other people come in and lease the space, we sell it, whatever that might be. That those monies that are generated from that are then in turn able to be put right back into programming for us. So, I think, yes, it's different. Yes, it's change. But I think there's a lot of advantages to doing this now.
Yeah, and I would say we've talked about and talked with Nancy and some other folks have too, some educational benefits to incorporating the Early Childhood Center into the elementary school too, just some opportunities for maybe that constructivist teaching going into the elementary school, some transitions that might be easier for our kids moving from Early Childhood Center into an elementary setting as well.
Very good. And to Jamie's point, while the district doesn't have final or firm plans on what to do with the early childhood and the central office building in Hanley Industrial Court, we have had multiple commercial real estate agents appraise this for us. It is in the neighborhood of a $3 million asset to the district. So that obviously would give us a lot of financial flexibility down the road, whether that ends up being a lease, whether that ends up being a full sale for the district. But either way, that's going to be a real asset that we can take advantage of so that we can not go back to the taxpayers as soon as we would normally need to. So next up, we had a question. Would the design of the buildings help to address concerns about COVID-19 or other pandemics? Obviously, a question that's on all of our minds at this time. And this, I think, is one of the most exciting opportunities about this whole plan that has came up. And I've had several conversations with our architects about this, and this would be a true opportunity as we went through the design process to be able to redesign and renovate two of our elementary schools to address what are those best practices related to a pandemic. Um, it works out well for us that our district architects, Ittner, have a lot of expertise in terms of working with hospitals, working in the commercial sector, and they're presenting just next week on the national level. They're presenting a paper about how schools can successfully re-enter and we can get students back into school. So we would heavily be relying on them. We could have a lot of great best practices. You look at everything from we talk about those secure entryways into school. Well, how can we set those up to really minimize contact? You think about things as simple as parents coming up during the day and wanting to drop off a book or a lunch for their kid. Well, you can have transaction windows. You could have transaction doors. You could have take a really hard look at what is the best form of an HVAC system in terms of those filters and reentry of air throughout a system. I just think it's a really exciting opportunity and one that through that extensive design process, I can assure you we will really take advantage of. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Okay. Keith, if you would, could you talk a little bit about what improvements can you guarantee will happen at each of the schools if Proposition E passes?
First, I need to make sure that you all can hear me because I haven't spoken yet. Can you hear?
You're a little distant, but I can hear.
Let me try to get close to them. Is this better? Can you hear me?
That's good.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. I was trying to decide if I had to patch my phone in. I'm not as much of a klutz as I'm sounding here, but apparently I am. Anyway. So a lot of what we can guarantee we're going to do at both schools, some of that has been touched on, especially what Dr. Lane just mentioned, as far as safe and healthy entrances and all those sorts of things. A big part of the redesign, so to speak, at the high school and the middle school that's been going on is controlling access to the building, and so we have a main front entrance that's secure and so forth. That's something that will be present in both elementary schools when we're done. Obviously, it's a different project in each one because one's going to be a new building and one's going to be a renovation, but they will both have those same features. A lot of other stuff that we've spent money on at the high school and the middle school is infrastructure, plumbing and electrical, HVAC and so forth. A lot of stuff that you don't see but is very important. So that's going to be up to speed in both schools. Obviously, one new and one improved to the extent necessary. Accessibility, I think that was mentioned earlier. Older buildings were built with many different levels, and modern buildings are not built that way for obvious reasons, so that everybody has access to every place. And so that's a project that's one way in a new building. In an old building, I've seen the designs that Ittner has, the architect has talked about as ways to make Mark Twain accessible, and that's pretty exciting that'll all be done. There's other features, collaborative and flexible learning spaces that are part of the way education is done these days, as opposed to the way they were when these buildings were built. Those kind of things are put to use a lot more. So those are the kinds of things that are, in my mind, seem to be a bare minimum or the minimum that's going to be accomplished in each of these buildings. Beyond that, there will be more, but there's design to be done and so forth. I think that's what I can think of at this point.
I mean, I don't know. I will go. I always get nervous. I hear the word guarantee, but what I will say is, Brian alluded to this. Dr. Lang alluded to this. Is we're going to have an extensive planning process where we're actively seeking input from the community, from key stakeholders, from teachers right across these facilities. And as we go through that, we will flush out, these various things. The things that Keith highlighted are just really critical things that since 2013, when this whole process started, have been on every board's radar this whole time. And so those are why these are things we know we need to go do. But I think it's really, really important that we embrace the notion of during this planning period with engagement from the community, key stakeholders, we're going to really flush out what that looks like. And, quite honestly, as a board member, my goal is to help ensure that we are maximizing what we're getting for these dollars, because ultimately, really what I want to see is we're spending as much money as possible where we can directly impact our kids, right? And this is going to allow us to be in a position where, as we move forward, hopefully we're not touching facilities to this extent in the next 20, 30 years. And all of our asks are going directly into the operational side, where we're directly compensating those that are providing services, education to our kids. And so, this is a tough ask because there is not a clearly articulated plan where we have everything mapped out. We get that. But what we are committed to do is spend that time to flush this out and make sure that we've got the best solution.
So, Jamie, I think this falls right in line with this next question that is asking, was the presentation from Ittner at the last board meeting an accurate depiction of how the schools will be designed?
Yeah, my take is no. I think this was a big ask of Ittner in a short period of time. Is it even possible, right? Is it feasible? And that was the ask. We've, over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, we've had lots of different representation of dollar amount at the various facilities. Really what this was is, in a short period of time, Ittner, could we even do this? Can we bring the ECC in where it would make sense? And quite honestly, one of our asks of them was, we do not want to take away from the exemplary delivery model we have for the ECC right now in that facility, right? And so part of that was, could we do that? And what was presented back to us was just a representation of, yes, it's feasible, and here is what it might look like. I'm going to go back, Brian, you're exactly right to the point we were just talking about. We now, with confidence, right, if you think about it, it was a model where we looked at how much space do we need, right? And we put this in, we look at square footage, and we put it through a computation that says, yes, and here's what some configurations might look like. We check the box, we can go do that. Now, here's the really hard work, is we've got to get this group together to go figure out exactly how to do that. So, I firmly believe that what will come out of this is not what was actually represented by Ittner. I also am very confident, based on the work that they do, that we could present this to the community and say, yes, it's feasible. So I think a big piece of this is, this really was intended to be a feasibility study. And what was presented back to us is, it's feasible.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make that I hope the community understands, is that I can tell you, I don't believe in any way that those what was presented will end up being close to the final design. I can tell you, after going through this process at the middle school, high school, we probably went through, I'd say conservatively, 40 to 50 different iterations of that plan as we involved stakeholders, as we involved the architects and design team. And I anticipate we would go through the same level of detail as we work through and vet this process. So we have another question that Keith could take the lead on, please, which is, they asked, the process to add the early childhood center to the elementary schools seems rushed. Why wasn't it considered earlier?
I guess the way to answer that, first of all, is to kind of back up a little ways in time. When we decided to do the Early Childhood Center, which I believe was 2006, but somebody may correct me on that. It was something that was Charlie Penberthy's vision at the time, who was then our superintendent. And so we decided to do that. Frankly, we got lucky at that time because the economy at the time was such that we were able to do that very economically. I've said this before, and it's kind of remarkable, probably never be able to say it again, but when we put out the bids to do the renovation of that building, I think we had 24 bids that were all under budget. And that's just a matter of, we didn't experience that with the high school, middle school project, because obviously the folks that do that work are all very busy, or at least they were up until very recently. That may change, obviously. But so we did that, and that facility has worked so well, and the childhood programs work so well. It was kind of not on the radar when we started the process of thinking about building improvements throughout the district, which wasn't long after that, frankly. Charlie Penberthy started talking about it, but that's about it. Throughout the time that David Faulkner was our superintendent, we had there were different committees and different studies, and time went, and time goes by, and we're at where we are now. Nowhere along the line did it really occur to anybody to be fixing the Early Childhood Center, because that's something that was working very well. And so, but anyway, so jump up to now. There had been some talk about it in my recollection, at and before the time we decided to put this issue on the ballot. But really, the big impetus came after we put it on the ballot, and all the things going on now, delaying the election and so forth. And there was a group of citizens who I think were mostly from the facilities committee before, got together and started looking for ways to, I guess you might say, think outside the box to some degree, and come up with ways that would, I think their goal was to assimilate the different desires that were in the community regarding the issue of one elementary as opposed to two elementaries. And so this idea came up. They studied it, and as was mentioned just a few minutes ago, Dr. Lane had Ittner do an initial facility or a feasibility study, see is this even possible and in the realm of possibilities. And the answer is yes. Now there's going to be, but the point is there's a lot of work to be done. So it kind of does seem, it seems rushed from one perspective. But what I would kind of say is that it's not rushed because this is very preliminary and there's a lot of work to be done. We might be faulted for having not thought of this earlier, but there's reasons why that didn't happen. I personally think at this point in time that if we don't think hard about it now, I think we should be faulted for that. And so we are going to be doing that, and it's not going to be rushed. Because, looping back to what Dr. Lane said a few minutes ago, there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of iterations before we come up with what the final plan will be. And also, with a little bit of luck, as Jamie said a few minutes ago, debt is cheap these days. That's good. And even a little more luck, maybe construction costs will be helpful to us as well. We obviously can't definitely count on that. We can hope for it with a little bit of reasonableness. So anyway, that's kind of where we are now on it. I kind of think, in my mind, it's a pretty exciting development because it'll take a few years to pull this off by the time it's all designed and done and so forth, but we could reduce our footprint in the district in ways it's not going reduce anything that we'd be otherwise using. So I hope that makes some sense. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I would just add too that, when we put Proppy on the ballot, we did talk about all these facilities would be flexible. We would figure out opportunities if we needed to modify the buildings moving forward. There was, some discussion down the road, if we moved the early childhood center to an elementary school at some point, would we design the building so that we could put an addition onto one of those facilities in the future? So to what Keith is saying too, we're just now getting to the point where we can start looking, if we pass Prop E, at what that design would look like. But the intent of these facilities have been to be flexible, and we're taking an opportunity to try and get more done right now and not come back for a facility pass anytime in the foreseeable future. So it can consolidate down to 3 facilities for our district as well.
I'd even go back. I do think if you look at just the work of the last facilities committee, we intentionally narrowed the focus there, and ECC was not part of that scope. I mean, Dr. Lane will tell you, we just went through this. It's a really, really tough conversation to have. And so for that question, I get it, right? Over the last 8 months, it feels like all of a sudden it's here. But if you step back before that, and if you remember the slides that Dr. Lane showed, in 13, 14, and 15, the whole goal is how do we maximize our dollars by, and do that in terms of our delivery while doing it with state-of-the-art facilities if we can. And the early childhood center was absolutely part of it then, right? But now as we got into this, we walked through that timeline. We talked about focus on the middle school, high school, and then we got really focused around the 2 elementary schools. That's why it may seem rushed, but ECC's been there. I mean, the board has been looking at a 10-year, 15-year financial plan since 13, very, very, very closely. Every year we look at that, and every time we walk through that, front and center is capital expenditures and what do we need to do from a bond perspective, and all the footprints are part of that. So completely understand why it feels like all of a sudden this was here. But if you even followed through the conversations at the end of last year, that was starting to be brought in, and it just, as we got into the time where we are, we took a different look at this. But again, I think the key here is it's always been part of this. Our goal, as we've said, is how do we maximize what we're doing with the footprint, right? We're really, I think the current board, if you look at our mission, vision, and values, our current board is all about the more dollars we can put into direct educational delivery, leveraging state-of-the-art facilities, the better.
Well, and there's certainly a component of that I think in terms of visionary leadership, and when you're looking at a district that serves roughly 800 students, for us to take a look and see what is the best way that we can serve those while still maintaining a reasonable tax threshold for our community. And I would certainly say, in my opinion, to have 3 sites, shows a real fiduciary responsibility to our community and really makes sense in a lot of ways for a district of our size. We had the next question. This is kind of a quick clarifying one that I can do. Someone was asking how the inclusion of the early childhood will impact the bond issue and their property taxes compared to the original Proposition E. And the answer to that is it will be exactly the same. We did not change the bond language. This was a resolution, though, a formal resolution from the Board of Education, that within those same amount of monies, the $29 million and the 47-cent increase, that we would be able to deliver both the elementary schools and the early childhood center being integrated as well. Anything additional on those? All right, this segues nicely into, we had a few questions in relation to, after people saw the feasibility study from Ittner, people had some concerns about what Mark Twain would get in the plan, or if there were pieces that were going to be left out of the Mark Twain renovation. So Lindsay, could you address some of those questions for us?
Sure. So as has been mentioned earlier, with the Ittner study that came out to us a couple of weeks ago, was a feasibility study. So those numbers aren't set on how much goes to either of the schools. And I mean, our board, we will make sure that that Mark Twain gets everything that it needs. Keith had mentioned too, accessibility will be there, secure entry. We've talked about a FEMA shelter, the classrooms. The way to save a little money that Ittner focused on was more remodeled space versus more new building for Mark Twain, maybe one of the things that changes. We know that having some flexible learning space is important. That would be something that would come up in the design process. But I mean, I feel confident that things that Mark Twain needs to be updated will happen with the money that we will be able to allocate towards Mark Twain. And in terms of, McGrath was always going to be a new building, so more of the funds were going to be going to McGrath than to Mark Twain as part of this process. But one of the things that's very important to our board, and will continue to be very important, is equity and providing great education to every student in our district. And that is going to be one of those values that we take to the design committee to make sure that the educational the value of those buildings will be the same. They may look different. The look of some of the classrooms could be different between Mark Twain and McGrath, but the equity in terms of what kind of educational value is provided to our students will be there. Do you have other specific questions with that one, Brian?
Well, the overriding concern I believe that you addressed is the underlying concern is, of course, equity, and I think you said it well, and I can say from my viewpoint that my primary value as an educator has been throughout my career equity for students. So I'm going to be directly involved throughout this process, and I can assure the community that my focus and my challenge to the design committee is going to be that we maintain equity throughout this process. And when we say equity, what, in my mind, we are talking about, it's not that the buildings are, of course, going to be identical, but it is going to be that every student has the same educational opportunity, so that we have the same programmatic capabilities at each building. I understand some people who watched the feasibility study by Ittner, heard certain things that ultimately, in my mind, aren't going to come to fruition. You start talking, we have flexibility as we go through this design process. So, my goal will be at Mark Twain as well at McGrath. We are going to have collaborative spaces. We are going to have spaces where we can implement our project-based learning. So if that means that, we're getting creative, adding a little additional new construction on to Mark Twain, if that means that we are, moving a few walls as part of the existing renovation, I fully believe that we will find the ability to do that by looking at both the sites with a fine-tooth comb in terms of the expenses.
Yeah, and I'll add just this notion of equity. I mean, those that have followed this process, we had intense conversations in the end of the year around equity and what does that look like. And if you think about it, what's most equitable for the student, which I think is what we are talking about, is you have the exact same facility that every student goes through, right? But what we've heard loud and clear is the importance of maintaining two footprints in the community. And so now what this board is very committed to is, as Brian and Lindsay have said, look, we're going to hold this design committee really to a standard so that we are delivering equitable opportunities for every child coming through here, right? And, this board spent months around mission, vision, and value. And I know sometimes, we look at that and it's, why? But a key part of that is, if you go back, we are really, really committed to each of the individual kids coming through there. And so, as long as I'm on the board, and I know this current board, we're going to push hard to make sure that it's equitable. It's not going to look the same, right? It's going to look very different. We know that. And as parents, that can sometimes be tough. But we're going to do everything possible to do that. And so I go back to whatever the original financial representation is. That doesn't. I think the board finished that meeting and said, "Oh man, that number is just a number." we are all about whatever it needs to look like to make this equitable for those kids that are going through the door over at Mark Twain and those going through McGrath. That's the key here.
Very good. That concludes the questions that were submitted in advance, but I'm going to start going through. We've had some good responses as we've done our live feed here. So let's taking a look at some of those right now, and we'll kind of start going through those. So here's someone, this is, no one ever cares about central office in my experience, but this is nice. They're wondering where central office is going to go. So thank you for your concern. Now that would obviously be part of the conversations. We would take a look and see, what is that long-term plan. Obviously, if fiscally, if it makes sense to sell this entire building, then and most likely central office would be part of that. Luckily, we're a pretty small crew over here. I've already looked at it. We do have some extra spaces that aren't being utilized at the middle school, high school building. So that would be a possibility, but we would further vet that, and put that into a financial analysis. Any other comments on that one?
Brian, I was going to say the basement.
I didn't want to say the basement, but yeah, it's kind of the basement, so that's all right. I'd be happy to take one for the team. Someone wanted to know how long the bond will last. It is a 20-year bond. That's typically what school districts have done. I think the exciting thing about this, which we didn't have a chance to talk about much earlier, is just the idea that at this point, if we're able to successfully pass Proposition E, we are going to have 3 sites. So we'll condense it down to 3 sites, and all 3 of those sites are going to be either brand new or extensively renovated with all new mechanicals, operating systems in place. So, I'm confident in saying it would be an extended period of time before we would have to go back to the taxpayers for any kind of a bond issue after that fact.
Yeah, Brian, that's a really good point. The financial side of this can get a little involved, but that 20-year note, we obviously have debt bond that was taken out on behalf of the taxpayers. But if you think about, we've got the ECC property, right? That in 8 years we will have finished our financial obligation there. So this really sets us up to be in a, honestly, if you think anywhere in the county, I don't know anywhere, we've looked at this hard, anywhere that would be set up in the manner in which we would. And then in that 7 to 8 years, benefit is coming back to the taxpayer in terms of we're not doing additional asks, which is a really, really big deal. If you think about 3 state-of-the-art facilities without an additional ask and the ability to go deliver that, it's a big deal. Particularly for a district of 800, if you think through, 850, 900, it's something to really think through as you're thinking about your position on this particular ballot initiative.
Well, that's exactly correct. And when you look at our neighboring school districts in the area, you're correct. I can't personally think of another district that could say that, all of their facilities are going to be up to date and renovated basically in that short period of time. It's very typical when you look at our neighboring districts that they have to come back to the taxpayers on a, roughly a 3 to 5 year basis in terms of continuing to look at bond issues and fixing up the building. So this would put us in a pretty amazing position of not having to continually ask our community for additional support.
Great, and it also means that all of our students are in updated new facilities in 2 years, which would be great, from early childhood, from 2-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and all of our staff getting to utilize those new and updated buildings.
So here's a great question that falls in line with that train of thought. In the long term, with this plan, will we be able to continue to be competitive in the market for getting great teachers and maintaining great teachers? I want to ensure we're being fiscally responsible with teachers in mind. Facilities can be great, but without great teachers, the facility is nothing. I could not agree more. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I will say this board is unbelievably committed to exactly that. I mean, look, facilities are important, no question, but we've had many conversations around if we had to choose, we're going to go get that money to those teachers and those that are directly involved in delivering education to our students. You know, we are very committed to that. In fact, you know, as we're coming out of this round of conversations with the teachers, I think you all, the community, will see the commitment to them in terms of making sure we're competitive. And quite honestly, why we've been having these conversations over the last 4 or 5 years, and then really around the last 8 months around how best do we maximize our dollars, it's for exactly that reason. I'd much prefer to get us set up where we're not going back for capital asks. The only asks we go back for are on the operating side, so that we continue to be at the top of the tier in terms of compensating our teachers and staff. I mean, Brian, case in point, if you think about what were we able to do during this crazy time, we're able to keep support staff on, and commitment to the early childhood, right? So I think look at that, ask questions of your board members around that, because I do think to a person, this board, and I believe all boards are really committed to that. It's, in the absence of really, really quality teachers, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we think very highly of our teachers, and we want to make sure that we retain and attract new great teachers. I also feel like if we've got great facilities for them to come in and work in that can support their, you know, educational mission with our students, that is also a benefit that we can offer to our current teachers and future teachers to come work here, and we will support you, and we'll give you a great place to work and a great place for our students to learn.
Well, and I think one piece that's important for us all to think about is while, you know, both the state and school districts artificially, you know, place our funds into these buckets of money, and as Jamie talked about with, you know, capital expenses and operating expenses, but ultimately we have a set amount of money coming into the school district. So when you look at things, and we talk about operating, you know, when we talk about capital expenses that are inordinately high, when we talk about buildings that are not energy efficient, when we talk about things that cost much more to repair than they would in a newer or renovated building, those will ultimately, over time, that money is going to impact the operating side, which is where we're able to pay our top-notch teachers and remain competitive from. So if we don't address these issues on an increasing basis, that will ultimately impact our ability to pay our teachers, to maintain our class sizes. So there is a connection, but maybe not in the way that many people would foresee. All right, next question. We had a couple questions that were about curious about how it might work to share spaces for an early childhood center and an elementary school, in terms of you might have 3-year-olds and 11-year-olds. You might have them sharing playgrounds or cafeteria spaces and so forth, and they'd like to talk about how to manage that. So I'll kind of kick that one off. I can tell you in my former district, we had a combination. We had both the early childhood center, and then we had multiple satellite locations that were in the building. And I can tell you the satellite locations worked very well. I personally preferred the incorporation of the elementary into the culture and climate of the early childhood into the elementary schools. That would be part of the design process, though, as well, because what you want to set that up is you're going to have a component, a portion of the building where, and we've already started having these conversations, you could, for instance, you could have a small separate parking lot for the early childhood parents to drop off. Certainly their own playground would be very feasible to put into place. And, you can divide your building into, sections or families is a very common theme that you see nowadays in design, where you do have the opportunity to share spaces when appropriate, but you also have the opportunity to have your own parts of the building. So I've seen it done well, and I'm confident that we would be able to manage that and do it well. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I mean, I do not pretend to be an expert in that, but I'll call our attention to the fact that actually we've been managing for years 11-year-olds in buildings with 18-year-olds. And so if you think about that, there's a big difference there, right? Different set of dynamics, but I'd argue 11 and 18, I mean, I'm witnessing it right now personally. It's a massive difference, right? And grown individuals, adults with people that are just coming out of elementary school. And so seeing that work, as Brian said, you create unique spaces. Yes, you got to be creative with schedules. I'm very confident that can happen. And quite honestly, if you go way back to, I mean, Keith, you've been here for this. I mean, the early childhood was in the back of the high school for a number of years before we moved out. And obviously it's grown significantly, but I'm confident we've got really good staff that are going to help us figure that out. And that goes to that whole stakeholder community. Part of that group is staff that are going to help us figure it out. We got to figure it out.
Yes, since Jimmy pointed out that I'm old and I remember stuff from back then. That's right. The preschool was in the high school back in the day. My daughter went through that. She loved it. It was it worked very well for what it was, and there were high school kids that participated, in certain things through the day. So these things lead to possibilities that you don't have otherwise. And obviously, it's not going to be in the high school, but there's other possibilities. So there can be lots of pluses to that. However.
Yeah, I get excited as an educator because I think about things like in our elementary schools where you have, for instance, the 5th grade students serving as families to the kindergarten students. Well, how exciting and fun would it be to see some of our students be able to go into some of the early childhood classrooms and work with those kids? How fun would it be to see that connection between some of our great programs like Leader in Me and working with the early childhood kids and those teachers. So I just think there's a lot of really fun and exciting connections there that we could make. We had a question that's I can kind of start it off, and then anyone can jump in, asking how would we use the money from, say, if we potentially sold the Early Childhood Center, the current 1201 Hanley Industrial Court, how would we utilize those monies? I think from my perspective, it's really more about flexibility right now. Personally, the board at that time would have the ability. Now that could conceivably be, if there were any additional components of a facility need, yes, they would have the ability to do that with the money, but they would also, to go back to that question about maintaining teachers and class sizes, that would also could serve to bolster the budget and, as we talked about, keep us from having to go back to the taxpayers for a much longer period of time. So to me, it's that underlying concept of fiscal flexibility where we protect ourselves down the road by enabling this visions. But I'll kind of open up the floor to any of our board members.
No, I mean, Brian, I think the short answer is we're not sure what exactly that would look like. The long answer that we as a board has talked about is that's exactly it. What makes the most sense to do? I mean, and look, that's our money, right? We were put on the hook for it. As that comes back, ideally, we'd use it so we don't have to come back for another ask and we extend that period. I mean, here's the reality, and we know this, we've talked about it. Brian mentioned it, public school, we deficit spend, right? We have a fixed set of money that comes in. We are dependent on revenue streams from a lot of different sources. Our district is really, really lucky that we are in a fairly affluent level with 95% of ours coming from local, our property taxes, et cetera, that we're able to do this. And so our goal is to give it back. And when we say give it back, it's in the form of we're ensuring we have quality teachers. We're ensuring we're, trying not to come back and ask any sooner than we have to, and quite honestly, extending it even further out. I mean, here's the other thing I'd say is this is why it's really important to stay engaged with this, because, right, as we said, it's a 2 to 3 year process, making sure you're engaged and you're speaking with board members, because that's the key.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It does lend some flexibility and some future decisions for the district. And it's one of our major tasks as a school board, finances, and to making sure that we're set up for the future. So when things like it had come up earlier with COVID, we were still able to, so far weather that fairly well and pay staff throughout the time that school has been closed. That's because some good financial decisions were made before we got on the board. And we would like to, I think, set other future boards up in the same fashion.
Well, and it's certainly important that, in light of COVID-19, and as Jamie mentioned, we are a school district that is heavily reliant on local taxes. Roughly 94 to 95% of our revenue comes from local taxes. So it's certainly judicious of us as a school district. We're certainly, of course, concerned in light of COVID-19 of what could be the long-term, short-term, and long-term impact on residential and commercial assessed valuation in our district and how that could impact us. So that's ultimately why it was important, in my mind, for the board to take a look and develop a visionary plan that would give us the ability to weather these types of storms both now and in the future.
Brian, I'll piggyback on that assessed valuation, because think about this. We put three brand new we have three very new state-of-the-art facilities in this current environment. We've all seen study upon study upon study that talks about education, right, and that impact it has on assessed valuations and the value of your properties. For us to really think through why this makes sense now is you put three campuses in there, the quality that we're talking about, the assessed valuation, the values of our houses are only going to, even during this time, we got to feel very confident that we've really protected our investment. And this is a really, really good way to do it. If you really think of that, this day and age, we hear, every day, one story is crazier than the other, but the ability to go do this and the ability for us to, quote unquote, protect our investments, I think is a really important consideration.
Very good. We've had a couple more questions come in since we've been chatting. One is someone's talking about their home's assessed valuation and their current tax liability, and they want to hear a real example. So for that, I would direct that person or any of people out there on our website. If you go to the school district, Brentwood School District website, and you go to the Prop E icon, we actually have a property tax calculator on there where you can both go to the revenue site, look up the assessed valuation of your home, and plug it into the calculator, and it will give you the exact figure of the tax increase. So I encourage everyone to do that. We want to be very transparent with those figures. We had another question. So is the entire building worth $3 million or just the early childhood center? Just a point of clarification, that was for the entire building. Now, that being said, these are commercial real estate people that are strictly, at this point, they're coming in, they're looking at the square footage. And what they're likely forecasting, or what I was told, or, this would be a company that might come in, basically raise the play, inside, and probably most likely turn it into a warehouse. So the reason I say that is, I'm optimistic that, if we could find the right buyer, or someone to lease the space that was especially looking at potentially an early childhood center, it could end up being, more fiscally, a better fit for the district. So, but yes, that was 3 million just in terms of the entire square footage. We had one more question, final question, that it asked, are our board members confident that the renovations to Mark Twain that would come out of this process will keep it current for the next 20 to 30 years?
I'd love to say yes, right? And I'd love to put that under the guarantee statement, but no, we don't know that. I mean, part of this notion of financial flexibility through incorporating this is that we may have the option then with that to, if we need to go do something, have those funds set aside. I mean, part of what Ittner presented to us and part of our ask of them was under this notion of feasibility is, what do we have to do to ensure we get the longevity that we need, right? But again, it's hard. 20 or 30 years. Every decision we've been making, we've been talking through this, right, as a board, that ideally that's what we're planning for. Can we say with confidence? I'm very confident that we have looked at this long and hard and talked about it for hundreds of hours to the point where we feel it made sense to make this resolution and come to you all with that. I don't know. I think Lindsay and Keith, what do you guys think?
Well, I think some of the things that Mark Twain needs today, and it will benefit the school for hopefully decades, is a secure entry, the accessibility, touching those classrooms and cleaning it up, the things that Keith mentioned, the HVAC systems, electrical, those things, a lot of the things that have happened at the middle school and high school will certainly make that building last a lot longer than if we are not able to put some money into it now. And, these buildings, there will always be some sort of upkeep cost, and we will not be able to build a lot of as much maybe new construction at Mark Twain as we had initially projected. So there is going to be some upfront cost, continued cost to, maintaining an older building. But I do think right now with what we are committed to doing at Mark Twain, that building is going to last a lot longer. And it's been said by several people, it's like the heartbeat of our community. It's that old school, that structure that the community really loves and values. And what we want to do is try and make it last for 20 or 30 years longer. And I believe this is our best shot of doing that right now. And I believe this is the best shot of maintaining our neighborhood schools at this point. And so I'm going to say I'm optimistic that we can do this, but there will be some continued maintenance cost to Mark Twain.
I would say ditto to that. It's interesting that Mark Twain is the older building compared to McGrath, but we had two different architects over the years look at it, and they both kind of came to the same conclusion that there was a lot of value to be retained in Mark Twain, and not so much for McGrath, and that's just the way it is. So will it last 20 years or 30 years or 90 years? We don't know, but our goal clearly is to do this for 20 plus years. That'll be a viable building. And keep in mind, as Lindsay just said, it's an older building. There's maintenance needs to be done. You could do, if you had money to spend now. I'm just pulling this off the top of my head. Sometimes, since I've been on the board, we've spent money on replacing windows in old buildings. A building like that may get new windows as part of this process, and they'll be good for a long time. But some parts of it may not, and those things, 10 years we may have some money on that. So I'm pretty confident. I'd say very confident that it'll be a good building for 10 years, but we're not going to be done you know, there will have to be things done in that period of time to keep it going for that long, but not big things in my mind. The sound infrastructure and everything is going to be there, and probably more cosmetic or tweaking things over the years.
Well said. And I think a key point is, once again, we keep going back to that design process, and the focus is going to be on flexibility of those spaces, because none of us can say that we know exactly what education is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. But if we make that a key component and value of that design process is the flexibility of those spaces, we are going to have that ability to adapt that to meet our needs over time. So, board members, that is all of our questions. I'd like to thank you for your participation. Anyone have any final thoughts for our virtual audience?
I guess I will just say, like, my goal throughout this whole process has been able to provide to help get money for our neighborhood elementary schools as this phase 2, as part of the phase 1 facilities process too. And I think we have a good plan. I'm hoping we can get enough community support to pass this. And as has been mentioned several times tonight, that design process will help provide us with a product that will benefit all of our elementary students and early childhood students and staff. And I'm excited that this is a possibility for Brentwood.
Yeah, I will say that I think. Go ahead, Keith.
Go ahead, Dean. Go ahead.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, you go.
I was just going to say thank you to all who is listening in, and unfortunately, I don't even know how many there are. Maybe I didn't touch the right button on my computer here to learn that a live meeting where we're all in the same room is so much better. You can see who's there and understand. But I'm assuming there are people listening, and I appreciate you listening to us, and I hope it was helpful. And you know, all of us and Dr. Lane and everybody's ready, willing, and able to answer any questions if things come up over time. But thank you. That's all I have to say. Now you can talk, Jamie.
Ditto. Thanks for everyone that would listen in. I would say that we recognize this is a big ask, even more so in today's current environment that we're in. I'd highlight that we as board members are all taxpayers as well and recognize the ask of this. I think the other part of our commitment to this as we sit on this and what we're going to ask of the design committee is it's 29 million. That's what the number is, and we've got to go figure that out. That's a big deal because that's what the ask is, and our commitment, my commitment as we sit on the board is to hold to that. You know, the other thing I encourage you is to reach out to us as board members, to Brian, ask questions. You know, we've got all are coming at this from different angles, we know, right? But ask and get out and vote.
All right, very good. Just so you know, we did have 86 people who tuned in and joined us tonight. I'm like Keith, I would have loved to have seen everybody in person, but I hope this was helpful to our community. And I would like to reiterate, if there are any questions, please go to the website. But even in addition, email me. Please reach out to me. I'm in the office every day. I would love to talk through any of these details of Prop E and answer any questions for you prior to us all getting out to vote in June 2nd. So thank you all and have a good night and stay healthy. And we're thinking about you and your families.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you all.